I study alien signals for a living, and what they're waiting for is terrifying. My name is Tom Brener. I've spent 12 years in facilities that most people only imagine in movies, remote antenna farms, maintenance corridors that smell faintly of ozone, racks of blinking receivers that collect the world's softest whispers and try to make sense of them. I learned to trust machines the way some people learn to trust their hearts. Machines don't lie. Machines don't grieve. Machines do what they are designed to do over and over until their failure is obvious and neat. Then, one night, I opened the wrong door. The facility is a cluster of corrugated buildings spaced like punctuation in a flatland. On most nights, it was the kind of place that allowed thought to settle into predictable grooves. Check the monitors, log anomalies, walk the perimeter, drink too strong coffee that tasted like burnt paper. Sarah used to mock me for the coffee. She would say, "Tom, if you're going to wake up at 3 a.m., you could at least let the coffee pretend to be good." I keep one chipped mug in my locker with a small crack that looks like a smile. Her handwriting on the back of a photograph, folded into a pocket, is the sort of marker that makes a man slow his steps for no reason anyone else can name. After she died, I learned to move through routines like a ghost moving through glass, present enough to avoid collision, distant enough to let the world slide through me. That distance is what the panel noticed first, I think. I can't say how a slab of engineered dark should perceive a vacancy in a human chest. I can only say what happened when my hand brushed the thing. The door I reached for should have been a utility closet. I'd done that walk 100 times. My feet knew the pattern when my brain did not. The knob was slick with condensation that night, and the building smelled of low-level electric heat and the faint undertow of rain. The room beyond was not a closet. It was a plane of depthless black inset into the wall, as if someone had installed a doorway to absence itself. The surface had no seams, no visible source of light. When I lifted my hand, the skin of it caught something like a pulse, soft, patient, a slow blue breath. I remember thinking, absurdly, that we'd found a new kind of sensor, some exotic substrate, and that I should log it as D2 auxiliary, notify a supervisor, file a ticket. The first rational voice in me said machine. The second, quieter voice said mirror. My fingers brushed the surface. The panel accepted touch the way water accepts a stone. It arced outward, a ring of light that felt less like illumination and more like attention. Then, not in words but in a verging on speech of feeling, a question that landed in my chest like a pebble in a well. Why are you empty? It is hard to write that line and not feel ridiculous. You learn in my line of work to attach qualifiers to the strange. So I will say, it seemed to ask. Or, in the fraction of a second when my rational mind chased its tail, a thing happened that could only be described as a demand for an account. I had not intended to touch anything that night, and the confrontational softness of that demand, "Why are you empty?" was the kind of sentence that doesn't answer itself. For days after, I told myself narratives to make sense. A new sensor, an automatic diagnosis routine, a stray waveform feeding a feedback loop. I wrote the observation into a report with numbers that looked reasonable beside it. Timestamp, humidity, ambient electromagnetic levels. I did the thing I had been trained to do. Treat the extraordinary as a set of data points until patterns either solidified or collapsed. Coincidence stopped being coincidence. The first small thing was a coffee cup. I smashed it in my hands without thinking, the spilled black arc catching the dim light, and a single bulb in the corridor stuttered. The log shows a brief power fluctuation, less than a blink,
but it caught on camera anyway. The feed from Corridor 3 captured the line of light pulsing at the moment my cup shattered. The camera record is the kind of thing an engineer looks at and files away as noise. But then the timestamp caught up with the personal. My heart had felt something acute, a hollow wrench that reached toward a place I had neglected to name. And outside technicians later told me the line voltage had dipped 0.03% at the exact second the cup cracked. The second was the photograph. We keep security stills for archives. One morning, sifting through a week's worth of routine passes, I found the frame I had not expected. A blurry shadow that did not align to any fixture or human in the frame, positioned a few meters behind me as I walked past the bank of receivers earlier that week. On the image, there was a darker absence that followed my stride without contour. I felt foolishly conspicuous looking at it, like peering at a bruise I could not show anyone. I started returning to the plane of black at different hours with different intentions. I pressed a gloved palm to the surface and watched the light travel up my arm. I came when I had eaten, coming from a state of small satiation. I came when I was tired. I came sleepless. It responded each time, but with different tempi and textures. When I was flat, the pulse was slow, the light like a distant lighthouse. When grief rose, when a scent or a song looped, and Sarah's face was an ache, the panel throbbed faster, the blue widening into scars that traced the knuckles of my fingers. It felt intimate and invasive at once. I attempted, cautiously, to test it the way a lab might test an instrument. I told myself, if this is measuring physiological response, then we should see correlations in biometrics. I brought a logger. I took heart rate readings. I recorded my voice. On one session, I recited the nonsense of weather reports, and then the sound of Sarah saying my name from old voice memos. The device did not seem to respond to specific sounds. It responded to the state behind the voice. All of this carried a pale distance because of the way my brain kept organizing the world. If the panel was a sensor sensitive to affect, that did not mean it had any consciousness or moral register. Machines can be tuned. Machines can misread. Machines can amplify error. But then other things happened that refused easy categorization. On the third week, a small outage occurred in the town a few miles down the valley. It was the sort of event that could be explained by a squirrel in a transformer. When I went home between shifts that night, the local feed on my phone showed a brief dip in the public safety line, then a spike, then a multi-agency alert that seemed routine until I watched the overlay of reports and saw a spike in reports of neighbors calling to ask after each other's well-being, an odd meshed thread of human contact that wasn't typical for that area. My landlord's wife called to check whether I had heard from the neighbor 2 houses down, a woman who rarely left her porch. Coincidence again, or perhaps in my tiredness a different pattern. I began to notice a hidden grammar in the world's small events. When my chest tightened, minor systems around the site shuddered in micro-faults. When I woke from sleep with a memory of Sarah laughing in the kitchen, I found a plant in the break room leaning toward a filament of light I hadn't noticed before. These were not fireworks, they were brushing currents. The thread ran through them, intimacy and effect. I recorded everything. Habit is its own religion in a monitoring center. We keep logs because memory is poor and machines are merciless. I built a catalog, timestamps, camera stills, waveform files labeled with my emotional state. The file names read like confessions: 2019-07-13 grief high.wave, 2019-07-18 neutral 2.mp4. And the absurdity of it made me laugh once, hard and brief, in an empty control room at 3 in the morning. Laughter in that hour is like tapping a glass with a spoon to see if it's sound. It echoed in the racks and died. That is where Marcus found me. Marcus had been with the program longer than I had, older, quieter, his smile more like a narrow door than a welcoming arch. He was the kind of man who kept his gloves in the same place inside his pocket and smelled faintly of cedar. He came in on a night shift that had been wet and shallow, the kind of night when rain writes thin fingers down the tin sheets and you imagine whole civilizations in the way the drops fall. We had crossed paths over maintenance schedules and the usual engineer banter. He had a reputation for being pragmatic to the point of being resigned. When he sat across from me in the little kitchen, his hands folded around a thermos, I expected the usual small talk about relay firmware and the ethics training we had both dutifully completed. Instead, he said, with that slow care of people who have learned to choose their words like tools, "Tom, stop poking at the wall." I thought he meant literally that I was going to get myself reprimanded for unauthorized access, but his eyes held a lit depth. "You're not the only one who felt it," he said. "I've seen it before. You look like you've been hollowed out by something." He didn't use the word grief at first. He let the word unwrap in the space between us. He told me about nights at a different installation, about lights that seemed to ripple when a radio operator sang along with a song that reminded him of home. He told me, with small, measured gestures, about a colleague who had taken a leave and then never returned, a man who later phoned to say he'd been somewhere you could not reach with a cell, and that he was all right now, even as his voice carried the thin slip of someone not dropping the weight, but shifting it. Marcus's stories were careful, not dramatic, clinical in their delivery, like a medical record with a tremor. "You're not imagining the pattern," he said, "but patterns don't give you agency. That's the dangerous part." When I asked what he meant, he told me about the vocabulary he and others used in whispers: interface, observer, mirror. He never called it alien outright. He used words that felt like substitutes: watcher, lens, and his voice dropped when he spoke of the thing he'd seen once up close, a presence the technicians called the observer in the few times the name had leaked to him. He shrugged as though the name itself might be too much, and then, as if to hush some part of himself who wanted to push harder, he said, "It asks questions it doesn't answer. It sees things we don't want it to see in ourselves. It doesn't judge in our terms. It just reflects." Marcus's confession could have been a cautionary tale. He could have been trying to scare me away from further investigation, but the opposite happened. His knowledge made the panel stranger, more significant. If others had felt echoes, then what I had touched was not a fluke. The idea that someone or something had placed instruments sensitive to the human interior into the fabric of these buildings made the world tilt in its tracks. "You could stop," Marcus said finally, folding the thermos lid back on. "You could walk out and never look at another monitor. You could go back to your mug and photographs and let the program file this as an anomaly. Or you could keep watching, but keep it measured. Keep records, and don't try to make it do anything." That last line lodged like a splinter. There is a peculiar attitude in people who work at the interface of unknown systems. They understand both temptation and the ruin of control.
Marcus's words carried the gravity of someone who had seen the temptation to push. What would happen if we tried to guide the thing, if we tried to harness the soft thread of human feeling to make machines do things in the world? He had seen the cost. "You sound like you're speaking from experience," I said. He looked at me long enough to make the space between us count. "I am. I've watched neat experiments go wrong. Small towns with better lighting, better attendance at church meetings, neighbors leaving casseroles on porches, all the little things a single intention can nudge. For a while, the numbers looked tidy. The trouble starts when people learn that nudging works like a screwdriver that can pry a door if you're not careful. They start to want outcomes instead of presence. That's when the sharp stuff happens."
He was vague on the sharp stuff because people like us learned to avoid naming horrors that would make any rational mind build barricades. He left the door open to inference, mental collapse, betrayals, disappeared volunteers. He did not tell me names, he did not supply dates, but his tone did the work of an autopsy. Looking back now, his warning was less a line in the sand than an invitation to notice the ground under my feet. He urged me to observe, to keep notes about my interior states without attempting to weaponize them. It was, in bureaucratic terms, a request for ethics. In human terms, it was a hand on the shoulder. After that night, I kept a rigid ledger. For every touch on the panel, I recorded what I had eaten that day, whether I had spoken to anyone meaningful, the precise tenor of my thoughts, the way the memory of Sarah had come, sharp as glass or dull as a bruise. I recorded how the panel reacted, the pulse length, the softness of the blue, the way the light pooled and then withdrew. I kept audio, I kept stills, I kept a separate file, one that I encrypted and hid in my personal vault, labeled with a single word: questions. Coincidences continued. On a day when I allowed myself to think of Sarah with a small smile, the mental rehearsal of her telling me a joke over our chipped coffee, an unexpected small act rippled outward. An intern at the facility, someone who'd been curt and distracted for months, walked down the hall and left a note on my terminal. Thought you might like a good laugh. The note had a doodle of a ridiculous thing Sarah would have loved. It was anonymous, but the timing was exact. At the time, I chalked it up to kindness triggered by office meme culture. Later, I would see the pattern return with more sophistication. I started to see the panel as less of an instrument than as a mirror that could be read in multiple ways. When emptiness pressed at me, the reflection deepened, and whatever line ran from my chest to the world thinned. There was an ethical dimension to that reflection. If feelings could be read, they might also be felt by other systems in ways we could not anticipate. If a small private grief could tilt the behaviors of systems nearby, lights, cameras, the pattern of neighbor calls, what would happen when billions of such states synchronized, accidentally or on purpose? I forced myself to tabulate the possibilities in the dry language of contingency. I reminded myself that correlation is not causation. I reminded myself that humans are spectacular pattern makers. Our brains are wired to see order in noise. But pattern making can become a kind of prophecy when repeated experiences confirm the hunches that terrorize us. There were practical obstacles to proving anything. The panel was in a locked facility. Access logs recorded my going and coming. There were cameras and other observers with whom I would have to share findings to get any sort of peer review. And sharing comes with peril. The first peril was being dismissed as eccentric. The second was being seen as dangerous by those in power. The third was being targeted by people who see an opportunity to exploit a new kind of leverage. One night I slept and dreamed a corridor lined with doors, each with a voice murmuring things back at me, memories, admonitions, bargains in languages I could not place. I woke with my hand pressed to the same chipped mug in my locker, its warmth a poor substitute. The thing I could not separate was whether I was being watched or whether I had been watching myself the whole time and projecting the observation outward. The panel blurred those questions. I began to notice a subtle change around other people, too. A janitor, Jenkins, who had never shown much interest in my life, started to perform small public niceties, sweeping extra long at my station, leaving a wrapped sandwich in the fridge one morning. Marcus told me not to read too much into Jenkins. "He's an old man who likes feeling needed," he said. Later, Jenkins would do something that had no plausible explanation. He slipped an anonymous typed letter into the mailbox of a woman in town whose son had been in prison, and the letter contained the precise line that convinced her to go to a hearing that eventually led to a reprieve. It was the type of ripple that made statistician minds itch with the temptation to circle graphs, to derive p-values and name the odds. It seemed that sometimes small groups, no more than a handful of people, could produce measurable local effects when their emotional states aligned. What the panel encouraged or revealed was not a direct lever, but a possibility. When attention and feeling cohere in a cluster, something in the field of local systems shifts. Whether the panel was causative or diagnostic remained the stubborn question. We could file reports that showed variance. We could hypothesize contagion models of affect. We could do as Marcus suggested and stop poking. Or we could keep watching with the caution of someone standing at the edge of a fragile dam and trying to learn when to hold and when to step back.
It was in the security archive, flipping through stills at a low hour, that I found the one frame that made my skin tighten. The image caught the corridor behind me as I walked towards the bank of receivers. A darker outline trailed a step behind my shoulder, but there was more. The outline did not match the angle of ambient light. It was, in that way, an artifact that resisted simple explanation. I enlarged it until the pixels decomposed into noise, and still the impression remained. Not a man, not quite a shadow, but the projection of something that was watching me as I watched a machine. Someone at the facility suggested a normal explanation, lens flare, a processing artifact. Another suggested a more unnerving human-free possibility. The system had recorded a reflective property in the material of the panel that was registering as absence on the camera. Neither explanation was satisfying. The only thing that explained the odd fit in my gut was the idea that whatever we were encountering had a patient curiosity. It was Marcus who finally said the thing I had been unable to voice. They're waiting to see what we do with what we might be able to do. He did not dramatize the phrase. He spoke it like a man reading a timestamp. Not a military waiting for a button, not a species waiting to conquer, an observation. Are we going to be wise with the power of shaping our world, or are we going to be messy and hungry and cause damage the way an untrained animal does when it finds a new tool? That is the line you can't easily argue with. It doesn't rely on the mechanism of how the panel reads you. It turns the issue outward onto the species. If it is true, if some non-human intelligence is waiting for a decision, then the ethical stakes climb beyond a facility maintenance log and into the shape of civilization. There was a quiet that followed Marcus's remark, as if the room had folded in on the sentence. The thermos on the table between us steamed. Outside, rain had started again, like a slow curtain. I wanted to continue my ledger, to let the machines gather their impartial data, to see if patterns held. I wanted to test in controlled ways the relationship between my interior state and the world beyond. But I also felt the warning in Marcus's voice. The temptation to translate feeling into deliberate action is enormous for people who have tools and an engineer's confidence. It's also a temptation that, judging from the rumors and the thin scrapes of history Marcus hinted at, a few had already indulged and paid a bill we did not yet understand. So I made a decision of sorts. I would keep watching. I would keep notes. I would not tell the supervisors until I had more than anomalies and coincidences. I would not try to steer anything. I told myself these rules like a litany as I returned to the bank of receivers and the plane of black. And yet the question the panel had offered did not leave me alone. Why are you empty? It clung to my jawline like damp. It nested in my sleep. It became the quiet ledger against which I measured moments of living. The way I would linger over a mundane conversation now as if it could be a small repair. The way I watched myself feel, an odd form of superstition, as if being careful about grief could solder the frayed parts of a life. That very morning, the chief engineer flagged an anomalous uptick in background radiation in a measurement band that had, until then, been a polite flatline.
The change was not large enough to cause alarm in the controlled systems manual, but it was statistically notable. The banner on the monitor flashed in a color code we used for review required. I logged it in the ledger next to a notation, woke thinking of the kitchen tile pattern Sarah hated. The next log entry is where my control ends and the story's pressure begins to rise. Marcus called me later that afternoon, his voice on the line low and direct. He said, "Meet me at the east service door at 2100. Bring only what you need." He did not give a reason that was more than a sliver. The sliver was enough. When I locked the facility that night and walked toward the east service door, the rain had stopped. The world smelled of crushed, dry iron. The padlock gave under my hand with the ease of salt dissolving. I had told myself I would go because I wanted answers. I had told myself I would go because the ledger needed cross-references. I had told myself I would go because it was what a technician does, follow anomalies until they resolve. I had not prepared truly for the way the air felt when the door opened on the other side. The air on the other side of the east service door tasted like a room that had been closed for a long time, cool and dry, the faint metallic tang you get when you open a safe. A single overhead bulb hummed somewhere out of sight. The corridor widened into a cavern the size of a small warehouse, and my flashlight landed on a floor that had been swept so thoroughly it looked like a plain. Marcus was there, but not alone. He stood half-shadowed, the thermos tucked beneath his arm as though it were an old, stubborn habit. Beyond him, people sat in an irregular ring, faces I did not know in the low light, their outlines comfortable and raw at once. A tall figure arose at the center of the ring without stepping into the light. It was not shaped like the machines I serviced, not like the angular racks and boxes that made up our world. It was improbable, too proportioned, too patient, as if a sculptor had tried to imagine a watcher and then stopped before naming it. My hand went to the pocket where the ledger sat, old habit, proof that I had not come empty-handed. I wanted to ask Marcus for a joke about stray firmware to settle the obvious strangeness, but the joke would have been a poor bandage. Marcus met my eyes with the same narrow, careful smile. "You brought your notebook," he said. "Good. Dr. Mendez will want numbers, and the watcher appreciates curiosity cloaked in modesty." I felt ridiculous at the admission. Modesty, a value one keeps when facing either a delicate machine or a thinly veiled cultural taboo. The person the others called Dr. Carla Mendez stood and came forward, moving with the brisk, economical grace of someone who had spent too many years translating complex ideas into pragmatic steps. She was smaller than I had pictured from the project memos, her hair pinned back, her face freckled with sun from bad fieldwork days. The kind of scientist who had learned to look at people without letting her empathy decide the instruments for her. She greeted me with a nod that was equal parts welcome and assessment. "Tom," she said, as if the syllables were a file she had just opened. "Thanks for coming." She did not introduce the others by name. She did not need to. Each of them projected a particular kind of attention, someone who looked inward like a surgeon, someone who held a cup as if it were an artifact, someone with the slow, practiced stillness of a person who had learned to wait and watch for signals from a body. They met my gaze like people who had rehearsed a ritual enough times to feel its limits. Dr. Mendez spoke without making a show of authority. She outlined in plain terms what the ring of people and the tall figure at its center meant to her. There was a project, she said, quiet and bounded. Panels like ours had been found in other installations, sometimes embedded in architecture, sometimes placed as freestanding discs. They did not always respond. Sometimes they were inert for years. Sometimes they acted like seismographs of feeling. Their technical properties mattered, she admitted. Material analyses suggested exotic substrates and engineered microfields. But the pattern that mattered to her, what kept her up at night, was behavioral, the thing we collected when we were other than our usual selves. We call them interfaces, she said, not tools, not weapons, interfaces. They don't take action, they reflect and, in certain conditions, catalyze. They respond to aggregated states. That is the observation we've been able to agree on across the different sites. She slid a tablet toward me with images and lines of numbers. There were logs, thinly annotated. She had the steady, calm voice of someone who had learned to couch radical ideas in operational language so they could be heard. You've seen your panel. You've felt the question it asked you. That question, why are you empty, exists in other histories we have compiled. Sometimes it is asked as a single pulse, sometimes as a prolonged solicitation. The responses vary. I listened, thinking of the chipped mug and the photograph folded into my pocket. The question had not simply been about a personal absence. It had the feel of a diagnostic that knew how to reach beyond the individual. Why are you empty had become a mirror I had not asked to be handed. At some point in the early minutes, time was hard to measure in a ring of people leaning toward a central quiet, the tall figure moved in a way I could not quite register as motion. It was as if the air around it shifted, the kind of motion that happens when heat rearranges light on a hot road. My ears popped, not from pressure, but from the sudden sense that the room had tilted towards something not human by intention. Marcus put his hand briefly on my shoulder. "Breathe," he said. The word was a small anchor. The first true contact with the observer was not so much an exchange as an opening. I do not mean words. The presence, it will help to call it the observer because it's simpler, made contact by modulating the feeling voice inside my chest. With the panel, the communication had felt like a question lodged into the muscles of my sternum. Here it felt broader, like a long hand running along the ribs of a nation. I saw or felt an architecture of attention, nodes where people clustered in grief or joy, channels where attention pooled and then spilled, and these channels intersecting in places we would call cities and online forums and front porches alike. It was terrifying in scale. For a second, I felt like a cartographer who had accidentally glimpsed the full topology of a continent and then had to close the map because the knowledge was too big to hold. There was an impartiality to the observer's impression, no drama, no moral finger-wagging. It presented evidence with the same patience Marcus used to warn me about temptation. You could not argue with the geometry of the lines. They were simple. Billions of feelings, when cohering, made patterns that showed up in systems not engineered to handle them. When the impression eased, the observer imprinted an image less grand but more intimate. A small cluster of 7 people in a circle in a town basement, their hands touching, their attention shared, and then a ripple in the local crime statistics a month later, a small but measurable drop in petty offenses reported that could not be explained away by policing changes or weather patterns. The image did not explain mechanism, it did not offer a manual, it offered a pattern. Collect coherence, see change. Then it withdrew again, its attention like a scanner completing a pass. Several things happened in quick succession thereafter. Dr. Mendez spoke of a catalog of micro-results, surveys that trended in certain districts after clusters of attention, a community garden that flourished after a weekend of focused tending by a small group, a string of neighborly acts that led to an emergent volunteer network in a place where nobody had volunteered for years. She used measured words when describing these events. Reported, preliminary, statistically notable within narrow margins. And she kept a scientist's skepticism as a buffer against grand narratives. "We're not claiming causality," she told us plainly. "We're reporting correlations and building models that might, one day, produce hypotheses testable according to norms that would satisfy the broader scientific community. For now, the work is bottom-up and small-scale. The panels are, of what we've seen, diagnostic and catalytic. They show us where attention is potent enough to nudge systems, but nudging at scale is a different problem entirely." Her last sentence hung like a thin rope stretched over a chasm. Marcus, whose face had been carved into a cautious plateau, spoke then with the voice of someone who had helped bury missteps in other sites. "We had a cohort that tried a directed nudge," he said. "He did not supply names or dates. He did not need to. They improved some metrics. People were safer in the short term, but the change created a dependence. When the group disbanded or drifted, the new patterns collapsed in ways that exacerbated fractures. People injured themselves trying to replicate the effect. That's the rubbing edge. Intention becomes instrument, and instrument becomes substitute." The ring of people listened as if to a confession. In my ledger, the inclines had the dense mechanical scratch of someone trying not to look too invested. All of us, Marcus, Dr. Mendez, Jenkins, the silent ones leaning on their chairs, had seen examples where local improvements had a counterintuitive rebound. A town with fewer petty crimes developed a sense among some residents that the problem had been solved, leading to complacency that allowed another problem to fester unnoticed. This was the core of the ethical dilemma Dr. Mendez had spent her career addressing. If some configuration of human attention could alter proximate systems, then who decides when and how to turn that attention into an intervention? If a small circle could seed ripples that reduced suffering in one neighborhood, what responsibility did that circle have for the second-order effects? What, too, of the broader watchers who observed our experiments from a distance, patient as tectonic plates? I wanted to ask the observer whether it judged us. The answer was not given in accusatory tones. The observer's impression folded over me like a quiet fact. We do not judge, we observe. We measure the effects of intent. We have waited long enough to see if emerging intelligences will choose to cultivate wisdom in tandem with power. There is a dread in that sentence that does not come from threat, but from a moral accounting. Power is a tool. Wisdom measures when to use it. The experiments Dr. Mendez proposed were careful and measured. They did not resemble grand rituals or televised proclamations. They were small, local, and tightly supervised.
A community center in a town 5 hours away volunteered to host a pilot. A volunteer coordinator kept paperwork. The group would gather in a basement room and focus on ordinary intentions: reliable parent volunteering, neighborhood watch coordination, mature conflict de-escalation. The idea, artful in its modesty, was to see if a group could, by aligning attention towards stable civic behaviors, shift certain measurable outcomes in community cohesion. We were 7 in the first cohort, chosen for diversity: a nurse who worked nights and had a patient's attentiveness, Jenkins, who had the veteran's knack for practical kindness, a retired teacher, a young mother who had lost the rhythm of community after a divorce, a systems analyst from a different site, Marcus, and me. Dr. Mendez administered baseline social metrics, attendance logs, community surveys, local police blotters, comparing months before and after the pilot. We were careful to have controls where possible: similar neighborhoods without an intervention, external analysts blind to the cohort's activities. The first month felt like a slow, blessed, ordinary miracle. People showed up for small tasks with an eagerness that surprised them.
A babysitting cooperative formed. A formerly neglected park got cleaned. The baseline numbers in petty theft and property damage ticked downward by amounts that, to a small office full of humble analysts, looked like a confirmation. We recorded it. Preliminary, reported, limited. There were human stories that could be told without graphs. A woman named Claire, who had been beset by neighbor disputes, found someone from our cohort who mediated a conversation that led to an honest apology and a new shared weekend schedule. A lonely man, known in local bars for bad luck, suddenly got a pie left on his porch with a polite note. These were small stitches, not revolution. They were, by design, local and consensual. The public results were not headline-making. They were, however, persuasive enough to attract attention from other project sites. We began to exchange logs and compare methodologies. The panels had not been brought into these communities as explicit instruments. They were diagnostic tools informing where attention could be fertile. It was a difference of framing that mattered to Dr. Mendez. She wanted the agency to remain with the community, not the project. Even as the cohort's results trickled in and the project's confidence grew, the doubt never left me. Each evening I went back to the plane of black in my facility and sat with a hand on its surface, recording the pulse, feeling the way the light pooled when I thought of Sarah helping me with a small household task. The ledger filled with odd little correlations that never became conclusive proofs. I kept thinking of Marcus's warning, "Don't try to make it do anything." The rule became my undercurrent, a thing I repeated like prayer.
The tension that lay ahead was not abstract, it was practical and human. Volunteers from other towns asked for our help with bigger problems, food deserts, violence hotspots, communities on the edge of failing. People asked, if a group of 7 could nudge outcomes in a small town, what could a trained cohort of hundreds do? The question had the glint of a solution and the smell of an ethical trap. We tried, briefly and cautiously, a scaled attempt. The idea was conservative: form a network of cohorts across multiple towns and coordinate focus on a single measurable civic goal, improving school attendance. We kept methodology transparent, documented everything, and involved local stakeholders as active agents, not passive recipients. But even with all these checks, the results were uneven. Some districts saw improved attendance, others saw transient improvement, followed by backlash as parents felt their agency was being bypassed by a civic machinery they did not understand. In one place, a rumor spread that outsiders were manipulating children's minds. It was a rumor fueled by fear, and it hardened into distrust. The project had not created a miracle. It had, in a modest way, nudged a living system that reacted in complex, often unpredictable ways. That unpredictability is where the term terrifying, attached to the watchers waiting, took its sting. If coherence could cause small local improvements, then coherence deployed at scale could produce unimagined effects. The observer did not preach, but the shape of the warning was clear. A species with the nascent ability to steer collective outcomes and without the cultural structures to temper that steering could create cascades. A cascade is not necessarily catastrophe. It could also be a positive planet-mending movement. But the same mechanism that helps a community garden flourish might, if turned toward narrow ends, amplify biases, create dependency, or produce social ruptures. The question that the observer had asked me, "Why are you empty?" took on an additional inflection. It became less about my individual grief and more a question about our collective aptitude for restraint. How would we steward power if, by aligning feeling at scale, we could change the world? Would we shape policies that held the common good as a virtue, or would we lean toward immediate gratification and impose outcomes without regard for consent?
We held debates in the ringed warehouse that lasted long into nights I now recall as a blur of coffee and tired-minded idealism. People argued in ways that revealed their deepest human economies. Some wanted to harness the interface like a public tool, deploy cohorts to ameliorate famine-stricken towns, eliminate hotspots of violence, engineer behavioral nudges that public health studies would approve. Their tone was practical, and their vision was noble. Others, scarred by unintended side effects, urged restraint.
They argued that a tool that changed human behavior was not morally neutral. It could be used to help, but it could also be turned into a lever for power. Who would guard the guard? Who would specify consent? What frameworks could be built that would prevent well-meaning interventions from becoming forms of social engineering? I remember Jenkins, who had once slipped an anonymous letter that nudged a woman to pursue a hearing, sitting silent for hours and then saying simply, "I didn't think of the consequences. I thought I was helping." His voice held regret without apology. He had acted from a kind of human impulse to fix what was broken in front of him, and the aftermath had shown him how messy outcomes could be when they are not part of a communal contract. There were darker rumors, too, of a cohort that had tried to address a gang's violence directly and had seen a spike in revenge acts among those excluded from the intervention, of a manipulated media narrative that had used an intervention to create sensational headlines. These were, in many cases, fragmentary and hard-to-verify stories recounted in the low light between experiments. Dr. Mendez accepted them without indulgence and catalogued them as cautionary nodes. It was at this juncture that the observer's message sharpened into something that was not a threat but an ultimatum of sorts. Observation would continue. The watchers would remain patient. They were not interested in enforcing law or preaching morals. They had waited through epochs and could afford patience. But the moral arithmetic they presented was blunt. A species that acquired the means to shape reality through aggregated will had a responsibility to cultivate wisdom commensurate with that means. If we failed to do so, the watchers' role would remain catalogers, not allies. If we succeeded, the watchers envisioned a kind of partnership, a possibility of assisted evolution rather than imposed engineering. I have labored to translate that tenor into words, and words fail. The point was not coercion. It was a simple, terrifying clarity. Someone or something was holding up a mirror and timing us. The ethical climax resolved not in a single dramatic incident, but in the slow weight of choices. The project convened an ethical council composed of local stakeholders, legal scholars, community organizers, and the ring of people who had been there at the start. We wrote charters that stressed consent, distributed governance, transparency, and a commitment to non-coercion. We refused, by group vote, to become an instrument of covert social engineering. We would not engineer outcomes without the explicit democratic participation of those they might affect. That resolution felt like a small moral victory, but it was also the start of a new kind of grief. To renounce the immediate allure of power, to choose smaller, slower paths, was to accept that suffering would not be remedied overnight. It was to accept that wisdom is not simply a set of protocols you can implement from the top down. It requires culture, education, and expansion of empathy, and the tedious, ordinary work of building institutions that prize patience. In my private ledger, a page is marked with a sentence I wrote after one of those council meetings. "Power without wisdom is speed without direction." I wrote it as if it were a calibration note on an instrument. It was a line that would pry at my thinking for months.
We adopted, collectively, a modest approach that Dr. Mendez called model and seed. Instead of pushing outcomes, the project would model desired states in local contexts and seed practices that might allow communities to adopt them voluntarily. We would teach practices of attention, yes, because the panels seemed to amplify attention, but we would do so like gardeners offering a method of tending, not as technicians imposing irrigation. We would catalog everything, make our data sets available, and insist on peer review. This shift changed the tenor of our gatherings. They felt less like experiments and more like practicing decent, patient presence. We trained ourselves not to fix, but to accompany. We watched and recorded, and when a local leader asked us to leave, we left. It was a humbling discipline. There were smaller moments of grace that felt, in their modesty, like answers to the observer's patient question. Jenkins began to take more small walks through the neighborhood, not with the intention to nudge, but simply to be noticed as human. A woman who had once been a fierce antagonist in a community meeting became an ally after she was invited to co-run a local bookkeeping class. The nurse from our cohort started a free clinic night, not because we had created a policy, but because her days on the job had revealed a slog of unmet needs. Those acts did not have to be accompanied by panels to be meaningful. In fact, the more we resisted instrumentalizing feeling, the more ordinary gestures seemed to matter. I returned to my old patrols through corridors and servers, but I returned differently. The maintenance of machines was, for me, less a refuge from feeling and more a school for attention. I took care of equipment the way a person sets a place at the table for someone they are trying to love back into life. I started leaving a warm cup of tea in the small kitchenette sometimes for the overnight techs and telling them quietly that there was a room in our building where people met and spoke about ordinary things. I did not make a sermon of it, I simply named small human facts. The security feeds still recorded me. The camera still captured the weird absence behind my shoulder on an earlier day, that unresolving shadow that suggested patient curiosity. I kept copies of the photos, codes to different folders, entries in the ledger that could not be explained away through simple optics.
But the shrine-like impulse I had once felt toward proof receded. Proof was less important than the work of living. One night, after a string of particularly empty days, where the grief of Sarah sat like a stone under my sternum, I found a sheet of paper folded and tucked under my locker's chipped mug. The handwriting was not Sarah's. It was small and neat. On it was a single line: "We are fewer than we think." No signature, no explanation. I felt an odd consolation that someone else, somewhere, knew something of my exact small condition and had been moved to say so. We kept the project small. We ran pilot studies that remained precisely that, limited in scope, transparent in governance, and rigorously annotated with caveats. The town where we had the successful first run reported dropping petty crime rates by a few % over 12 weeks. Our data was careful in framing the results as preliminary and situational. When asked by local journalists, Dr. Mendez spoke of the work with intentional modesty. We refused to become messiahs. There were those who could not be convinced. Some volunteers argued that bold action was morally imperative. If you could save lives now, why cede advantage to slow democratic processes? These were sincere arguments. They carried a utilitarian bluntness that was seductive to people who had seen suffering in the immediate present. Others cautioned that unbridled action would create the very harms we wanted to prevent. Those arguments were born of experience and the ache of fallen plans. The observer watched with an impartiality that was both obscene and comforting. It seemed never to tire. It allowed us to proceed with mistakes small and large and catalogued everything without offense. I had expected threats or cosmic judgment. The reality was simpler, a quiet, implacable monitoring that assumed we might yet fail or succeed based on our own deliberation. There were moments when the watcher's patience felt too cold, like an indifferent universe waiting for us to trip. I resented them in private ways. Why wait, I wanted to shout. Why not step in and tilt the scales the way a parent might when watching a child reach for a hot stove? The answer, when I felt it, was that a hand strong enough to prevent some harm could also stop a child's growth. There was a humility in the watchers' refusal to intervene. They had, perhaps, measured the long arc and decided that unearned help could ruin an organism's ability to become wise. One of the hardest nights came when a coordinated cohort attempted to assist a community on the edge of losing its small hospital. The logistics were complex, the need visible, and our enthusiasm high. We coordinated volunteers, offered focused attention practices, and tried to seed increased clinic attendance. The immediate outcome was positive. Appointment numbers rose, donations increased.
But then, a larger structural problem surfaced, a mismanaged billing practice at the hospital that volunteer energy could not fix overnight. The community reacted with brittle anger at outsiders trying to fix what needed systemic overhaul. That backlash birthed distrust local politicians leveraged for their gain. Consolidation of power by leadership who promised to manage external help, and a messy, painful recalibration of our role. We had meant to help. We had been naive about the subtle politics inherent in civic systems. The lesson was not that we should never act, but that even good acts require political wisdom, institutional know-how, and humility. A community's problems were not solely technical deficits solvable by concentrated kindness. They were also entangled with history, power, and policy. When I think of the observer's terrifying patience, I think of that hospital night and its aftermath. The watchers were not waiting for humanity to do nothing or to behave in saintly ways. They were waiting to see whether we would develop the structures to wield certain powers without collapsing into short-term wind-chasing. During that season, Sarah's memory became both a ballast and a blade. I would sit in my car after shifts and replay her laugh, the way she corrected my grammar like a lover instead of a teacher. The ledger took on more human entries, lines about coffee made properly, about calling a friend, about giving someone space in a meeting. I made small rituals into holdings, not because I thought rituals would control cosmic watchers, but because they helped me live into an ethic of stewardship. Stewardship, I learned, is not purely a public policy. It begins with how one answers a small private question when no one is looking. Eventually, we convened a larger meeting where the observer spoke with a clarity that pierced the practical discussions. We observe your capacity to think and to feel. You are entering a phase where feeling and thought can aggregate into material outcomes. We will watch whether you foster institutions that value wisdom, not just results. The stakes are not our desire for you to fail or succeed. They are the preservation of a planet where emergent intelligences can flourish responsibly. It felt like a sentence from a tribunal without judges. The implication was clear. The watchers were assessing our readiness, not to punish us if we failed, but perhaps to delay certain degrees of involvement until we had matured as stewards. In a way, the watchers' waiting felt more like a test of character than a cosmic ultimatum. It was terrifying because it exposed the depth of our shortcomings and the long timescale of moral growth. When the project began to publish its early findings, we did so with the forensic care of people who had seen how narratives can be weaponized. Our reports emphasized limitations, our methods, the impossibility of definitive conclusions.
We presented case studies in which small cohorts produced measurable local changes without claiming that these results proved a global mechanism. We invited critique. We opened our datasets to independent analysts. The reaction was mixed. Some applauded the caution, others accused us of cowardice. Both responses were human. The last major experiment before I stepped back from the field was not dramatic. It was quiet and bureaucratic and intimate. We were asked by a small rural district to consult on a community mediation program where long-standing feuds had left several families estranged. We formed a team of mediators, ran several workshops, invited the community to decide the terms, and then watched. The changes were not monumental. Families sat across tables and listened to one another. Some relationships repaired, some did not. None of the outcomes were pure. But what struck me most was the change in the neighborhood's ambient attention. People began to notice one another in small ways. A man I had seen as stoic stopped staring at the ground in stores and started making eye contact. A woman who had been isolated again attended a community sewing circle. These were near invisible shifts. They did not require panels or watchers in any visible way. They were human work. The observers recorded these micro-changes as data points, and the project archived them as instances of concordant attention correlated with improved social metrics in small scales. That label is clinical, but we all knew the human truth beneath it. Slow, patient presence bears fruit only when it is honest and lacks coercion. The end for me was not a grand revelation, but a quiet departure. My name remained on rosters, my hands still had the small calluses of someone who replaced filters and soldered broken connectors, but I started to spend less time leaning on the plane of black and more time walking through neighborhoods in the daylight, meeting people whose names I had only read in reports. When the panel pulsed under certain conditions, I still recorded it, but the record felt less like evidence and more like a conversation I was having with an unknown friend about what matters. The thing the observers were waiting for in the vocabulary that had become ours was not a ritual act, but a slow cultivation, the growth of institutions and cultures that could steward emergent capabilities with humility and wisdom. It was the difference between using power to force immediate order and nurturing the ability of communities to choose better outcomes for themselves. The terror was not of external doom. It was of our own hubris, wielding a nascent capacity without the moral muscles to guide it. I do not mean to sound triumphant about the choices we made. We made plenty of mistakes. People left the project in disillusionment. Others stayed and grew. Marcus kept his hands in the work until the day he decided to retire to a small town where he tended a public garden. Jenkins taught a workshop in practical kindness and, in his off hours, built a small shed for neighborhood tools. Dr. Mendez published papers that were cautious and data-rich. She also organized forums where communities could learn civic methods of deliberation and consent in the face of technological temptation. As for me, the work changed the way I understood grief. Sarah's absence became a particular kind of teacher. The panel's question, "Why are you empty?" morphed into a practice to notice the places in my life that felt hollow, and then, rather than trying to erase the hollow with action, to fill it with attention directed at living well. Attention, it turns out, is not merely a tool for affecting outcomes. It is the raw material of moral life. I share this because the title of this account is blunt. I study alien signals for a living, and what they're waiting for is terrifying. The terrifying part is not a laser or a threat. The terrifying part is that a silent, patient audience has placed a mirror to us and will watch whether we can learn to live with power responsibly. That watcher's waiting
forces us to ask whether we will become wise before we become powerful enough to remake large systems. If this resonates, try observing your inner patterns for 2 weeks. Notice how your moods ripple outward in small, ordinary ways. I put a note to that effect in the pinned comment if you want a simple sheet to guide you. I have come to a solution that is small enough to be human and large enough to matter. Live intentionally. Model the change you hope to seed. Invest in institutions that teach patience and public deliberation. Teach consent like a civic skill. Prioritize transparency over efficiency when the two conflict. Where possible, make your influence available to those who will be affected instead of imposing outcomes from afar. There is a final humility in the work I describe. No single person, no single cohort can flip a species' arc. The truly transformative moments will be slow and cultural, not theatrical. The observer's patience may extend across centuries. Perhaps they measure epochs in a way we cannot grasp. All the same, the practical, immediate work we can do is not negligible. If tiny, disciplined communities can show that attention aligned with humility can produce local benefit, then those patterns are seeds, and seeds can spread if tended and if conditions allow. In the end, I did not become a prophet. I returned to machines and to the ledger and to small acts of neighborliness. I married the attention to daily life that the panel's question had forced into being. Sometimes, late at night, I press my palm to that plane of black and feel nothing dramatic, only a patient blue pulse that whispers like a lighthouse. It still asks things in the way a thermometer asks a wound how it is healing. It does not scold. It merely keeps a record that may, someday, matter.
The watcher's waiting remains, and that waiting is both terrifying and useful. It is terrifying because it holds up a mirror to human frailty and greed. It is useful because it imposes an external deadline. The moral work of maturing needs to happen before the tools we could wield become too easy to abuse. If you are sitting with the peculiar hum of curiosity that this all suggests, know this: you are not alone. There are people making decisions, arguing long into the nights, trying to build governance and local wisdom. There are small cohorts in basements and community centers practicing presence and cataloging outcomes. There are researchers like Dr. Mendez trying to keep their science honest and small and civic. There are men like Marcus and Jenkins learning that good intentions require structures to keep them from becoming harm. I cannot promise that our choices will be enough. I cannot promise that the watchers will one day step forward like benefactors, or that they will intervene to save us from ourselves. All I can promise, the only honest thing I can promise, is that notice matters. The simple act of noticing how you feel and how that feeling translates into small actions is a moral exercise that compounds. It is not a magic wand, it is a habit. If you want to read more about what we observed, stories we documented, data sets we released, the ethical frameworks we proposed, there is an e-book that collects some of the project's public reports and reflections. It's modest, annotated, and offered as one resource among many for those who want to study rather than to command. I've included a link in the pinned comment for anyone who wants to look. I offer optional private sessions with coaches from the project for people seeking deeper work. They are not a magic cure and come with no guarantees, only guided attention and conversation. The invitation is optional, and I make no promises beyond disciplined listening. The lights in the warehouse still hum sometimes when I think about Sarah. The panel still asks its patient question now and then. The observer watches, and so maybe do you. What shocks me less now is the scale of the problem. What frightens me more is how ordinary the solution seems to be. Patience,
consent, governance, and an ethic of stewardship. The Watchers may be waiting for something terrifying, but they are also offering us, in their patience, the best possible mirror, a chance to notice who we are, and then, perhaps, to become who we might better be.